You've probably heard that attachment is the root cause of suffering. But have you ever considered that you might be attached to your suffering? Sometimes the reason it can seem so difficult to get free from suffering is because we're attached to it. And that might sound absurd. Why would anyone be attached to their suffering? Why would anyone want to suffer? But there are ways in which our suffering might afford us certain benefits. Now, we may not be aware of this because it's all happening unconsciously, but it's certainly worth exploring. So, we have our persona, the person we think we are, the person we present to the world. And suffering can be one of the things that defines our persona. It can be a significant part of our identity, that who we are is someone who suffers, that who we are is someone who is hurt or broken or a victim. And we might feel that we are a victim of circumstances or other people, a victim of society or culture, a victim of life itself, that life has not treated you fairly, that life has not given you what you deserve or has given you too much hardship. And we might feel resentful. We might feel that we are owed something. And the benefit of being a victim is that you don't have to make any effort to improve your life. Being a victim means that you're helpless to do anything, so you couldn't change things even if you wanted to. That's the belief, anyway. But because the circumstances are someone else's fault, and you have no control of it, you expect that someone else should take responsibility. There's a sense of entitlement, that you should have certain things, but someone else should be the one to provide it. Now, in some cases, no one does anything at all to help, and you just go on feeling resentful. But at least you have the excuse not to do anything. At least you're free from the burden of having to be responsible for yourself, responsible for your circumstances, for your behavior, and so on. Being a victim can be a very convenient excuse. But sometimes, by presenting ourselves as a victim, we can elicit sympathy from others. And through that sympathy, we can persuade them to do things for us. If we can convince others that we are helpless, then perhaps they will help. Even just seeing that we are unhappy, people will want to do something to make us feel better, even if it's just giving us some positive attention. So in some way, our suffering becomes like currency. We can use it to acquire things. We can use it to get things from others, even if it's just sympathy and attention. Sometimes that can be enough just to get a bit of positive attention, to have someone fawning over you, telling you how wonderful you are, how special, how worthy. And the more we devalue ourselves, the more they tend to flatter us. Or, in some cases, we might use it to excuse our poor behavior, so that if we are behaving in a way that is selfish or unkind, and someone calls us out on it, we can say, "Don't you know I've had a hard life? Don't you know that I've been hurt? Don't you know that I'm suffering?" And sometimes others will tolerate our behavior because they feel sorry for us. And so we don't have to change. We don't have to be accountable. And there can also be some level of comfort and security in suffering. If we're accustomed to it, if we've spent much of our life feeling angry or depressed, or feeling hurt or heartbroken, or ashamed or unworthy or hopeless, it's what we're accustomed to. And we might feel strangely uncomfortable without it. Perhaps there may even be some fear, because if our suffering is excusing us from taking responsibility for ourselves, for our life, to step out of that and take some kind of action to do something different, or to do something that we've been avoiding, it can be very unsettling. And so we might retreat back into our suffering because it feels safe. At least there we don't have to make an effort to change. We don't have to step out into the unknown, into the unfamiliar. We don't have to take risks. We don't have to face our fears. So in this way, our suffering may be providing us with some kind of benefit. And if we were not to suffer, if somehow the suffering ceased, then we might not be able to take comfort in those benefits. And so we had better hold on to it. And perhaps the more we suffer, the more we might benefit. So we might prolong our suffering by ruminating, or we might intensify it by the way in which we interpret situations and circumstances, or rather the way that we misinterpret things, or the way we magnify difficulties, how we blow them out of proportion to make them seem worse so that we can suffer more intensely. And of course, all of this feeds the ego. The ego thrives on suffering. Suffering fortifies the ego. And notice how you might look for drama and conflict, how you look for things to complain about, things to disagree with, to be opposed to be angry about, to be offended by, because all of that gives strength to the ego. One of the things about ego is that it likes to feel important. And in some sense, it is this sense of self-importance that gives rise to suffering. But suffering in turn feeds that sense of self-importance. When you feel offended, for example, it's a very personal thing. You take something personally because you think that you're very important. But at the same time, the anger you feel, the indignation, the judgment, the animosity that you feel toward the other, that they are wrong and you are right, that they are bad and you are good, this gives some sense of superiority, that you are better than they are. And there's nothing the ego likes more than to feel superior. But even just to have self-pity, let's say you're all alone, just feeling sorry for yourself. Even this is feeding the ego, because if you notice, you can be very absorbed in yourself, so much so that you have no thought, no consideration for others. You don't care about anyone else. You don't care about anyone else's suffering. You may not even be conscious of the fact that others are also suffering. You're so absorbed in your own suffering, it doesn't even occur to you. But even if it does, your suffering is more important because you are more important. And to be more important than others means that somehow you must be superior. Even though you may be suffering with some sense of inferiority, with some sense that you are inadequate, that you aren't enough in some way, that you don't measure up with others, still, even in those moments, You're more concerned with yourself than anyone else, which means that somewhere deep down, you must think that you're more important. And as long as suffering is feeding the ego, it's going to hold on to it. It's going to look for opportunities to feel upset, to feel offended, to feel victimized, to complain and criticize and condemn, to be resentful, and so on. So I wonder if we can look at our suffering and see if perhaps we might be getting something out of it, if there is some benefit that we derive from it, whether materially or psychologically, if it's offering us an excuse to avoid responsibility or accountability, or simply reinforcing our sense of self, our identity, our ego.